Beth, sometimes we find ourselves in the midst of difficult, challenging conversation when we least expect it. What are some things we can do or say?
I think the first thing is to acknowledge that it's a difficult conversation. We're genetically wired for fight or flight when we're under attack. We're either set up to fight back or to run away. So just when we need our brain, our thinking skills the most, our blood has all been diverted into other parts of our body so that we can respond to the threat. So acknowledging that it's a threat is a really important step. Crucial conversations or difficult conversations can be emotionally risky, but they can also be really productive. It's an opportunity to solve an issue that you might have. It's an opportunity to build or strengthen a relationship. So stepping back into that is really important. Carrie Patterson's book, Difficult Conversations, points out that we can only have productive conversations when we can establish an imaginary circle of conversation. And we only stay in that conversation when we feel safe. We feel safe when we feel like we're being respected, that we're being treated with dignity. We feel safe when we feel like both of us have at least similar goals for the conversation. And as the conversation becomes difficult, that safety has been violated in some way. We either feel like we haven't been respected, or someone hasn't heard our point of view or doesn't care to hear our point of view, or we feel like maybe our purposes are not the same anymore. So what happens is that we leave that safety of the circle, and we either attack by perhaps interrupting or labeling or trying to control the conversation, or even getting angry, or we might withdraw to say, oh, I'm not going to talk about that right now, or never mind, I don't care. So it might just be masking those feelings too.
What are some specific things we can do to make a person safe?
I think the first thing to do is to learn to look at what's happening. We all have a very inherent sense of the moment that a conversation has turned to a negative conversation. So learning to look and acknowledge that, and as we discussed in the last time, acknowledging those three pieces of the conversation and taking steps to get back into that circle. So the steps that you take depends on your style under stress. You might be someone who is an attacker, and you might need to stop and sincerely apologize. And remember, what were your goals for the conversation? You had this conversation because you wanted to accomplish some instrumental goal, but you also probably have relationship goals that you'd like to accomplish. So you need to ask yourself, what do I really want? And then you need to ask yourself, am I acting like that? Do I want to win, or do I want to find the truth? Do I want to be right, or do I want to learn something? So getting back to the goals is really important. So then back to your style under stress. If you're an attacker, you've got to step back and apologize. You might ask for a timeout. You might say, we're not really getting anywhere. Let's talk about this a little bit later. If you are a withdrawer, then you've got to acknowledge that by not sharing your side of the story, you're not going to get back into that productive circle. So you might need to stop and say, you're right. I have not told you everything that I need to share with you about this. Would it be okay if I shared my perspective? So one of the other most important things to do to make sure that you're back in that circle of that imaginary circle of conversation is to make sure that you make your thinking process visible to the other person, and then you invite them to make their thinking process visible to you. And that might be hard because, as we said, it could be emotionally risky to admit those things. But in terms of making your thinking process visible to someone else, it's important to share your facts and your perceptions about what happened and what that meant to you and what you were thinking about. And then it's important to ask the other person to share their perspective. So you're really asking some questions that test things. Were you thinking that was unfair? Or did you feel like I hadn't taken adequate time to hear your point of view? And those questions are really important. It's key, though, that we avoid questions that start with the word why.
Why should we avoid asking why?
I'm glad that you asked that. The word why is really a trigger word. People, for whatever reason, people tend to believe that questions that start with the word why are attacking or accusatory in some way. And part of that is tone. Well, why did you do that? But generally the word why can really be a trigger word for people that can serve to raise their level of emotion instead of to diffuse the situation, which is your goal here with the questions. The other word that is a trigger word is but. people tend to think that if you've said something and you follow it with the word but, it means that everything that comes after is no longer true, and that's really not the case. So you have some other choices. You could say still or and or however. So avoiding questions that start with why and the word but in the middle of that conversation is important. So let me give you one example of trying to clarify your intentions. You might say something like, I'm not trying to question your authority, but I wanted to find out what information you were using. And that but kind of sets up the first one as a negation. If you switch out the word and, I'm not trying to question your expertise and your authority, and I'm really just trying to understand what database we were using as we came to this decision. It seems like a much less aggressive kind of question or statement.
Mm-hmm. This is great advice. All right, what comes next? I feel comfortable that we understand each other's positions and feelings. What comes next?
The final part of a really productive conversation is once we understand where the other person is coming from, we have some opportunities to agree, to build on what we agree on, and to move forward in a productive way. So the first part of that is figuring out what it is we agree on. And sometimes we have positions that we're holding, but we're holding those positions from some deeper seated motivation. So once we really understand one another, so if you and I are having this conversation, I might be able to find out what you really wanted, what your deeper motivations were for the stance that you were taking. And once I know that, then together we can brainstorm some mutually agreeable solutions. So if we can do that, we can agree on that and move forward. Sometimes there will still be things we don't agree on, and in that case, we need to look at what we do agree on and then try to decide how we can build on that and compare. Finally, we need to decide how to decide, and that in a lot of ways depends on the relationship that we have. We might decide to table it and come back later or go gather more information. Or we might decide that there are pieces of this particular issue that we can't agree on, but that our relationship is so much more important as colleagues or friends or supervisor and employee that it's okay to move ahead that way. So we need to agree and build on what we agree on and compare that, and then document how we're going to move forward. If we haven't documented, especially in a work environment, if we haven't documented how we're going to move forward, we might not end up having a really productive conversation.
I think you're making a very important point. We have a choice here. And sometimes we feel that we only have two bad choices. We are either going to confront the person and bring our concerns and risk that they get angry or aggressive, or we can hide our feelings and say nothing. But there's a third choice. We can actually learn how to have difficult conversations and make sure that everybody in the conversations wins at the end.
Absolutely. And again, it's emotionally risky to do it, but by applying some of these tools, the asking questions and being sincerely curious about the other person's point of view, remembering what your goal was going into it, not only in an instrumental way, but also in a relationship and an identity way, and being willing to share your side of the story and sincerely inquire as to the other person's side of the story. And when we do that, we really can have a productive conversation.
All right, Beth. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your talking to us. It was a pleasure.
You're
Always
welcome.
a pleasure.
Thank you.